I have to be careful what I say. I do want to say one thing before I start. Earlier I kept looking at this clock, and it's always 2 minutes before your service time starts on the clock behind you, and that's like, I was like, oh, we're still not starting. Okay, audience participation time. Close your eyes. I want you to imagine a plate of food in front of you that you need to cut to consume. So like a steak, or if you're a vegan, like a cabbage steak, or an Impossible Burger. I don't care. I don't tell you how to live your life. I want you to mimic the action of cutting your food. I want you to be very thoughtful about this, and bringing the food to your mouth. Go. You're messing with me. Okay, open your eyes. Some of you kept the knife in your dominant hand and cut, and brought your non-dominant hand to your mouth. Did any of you switch hands? So, here's the thing. Most Americans will cut with the knife with their dominant hand and then switch hands and take the fork in their dominant hand to eat. Most people in Western Europe don't do that. They tend to keep the fork in their non-dominant hand and bring it to their mouth, which, by the way, is what I grew up with, and I do it. I was reminded of this because a YouTube video of an American woman talking about eating in a British restaurant switched hands. And her comment section wasn't about her review of the food, but about the fact that she switched hands and that she was eating wrong. Or more specifically, wrongly, but we won't get into that. Well, we won't necessarily call this sort of behavior a ritual. It does have the earmarks of one. No one really taught us how to eat unless you were in a very fancy family or environment. But we learned by watching those around us. And it is, according to these comments, something that joins a community. The British people really felt it was important that you eat it correctly. Rituals are actions that have meaning to an individual or a group that creates comfort and often community. Cutting dinner may not be this, but it is. What did I do? Now I've lost everything. And it's being recorded. So the way that she was eating created a disconnect among some people. We don't normally think of our daily routines as rituals because rituals are often associated with a religious practice. The actions taken as a sacred community have meaning beyond the individual or even the group, as it often connects the people with their understanding of the divine. The lighting of the chalice, the sign of the cross, the removing of shoes, the beating the breast for atonement, the wearing something on your head, all connects people to each other and often their understanding of holiness or the Holy One or ones. When Jacob in the Torah that I read earlier felt God's presence, he engaged in a ritual that was typical of his time. He built an altar. To him, it was a way to connect the divine presence he felt and leaving a marker for others to connect with it. Even changing the name of a place reflects this. There are times that group leaders create rituals that become part of the community practice. And that's true when you talk about what Tevye said. All of that stuff, he doesn't know where it came from, but it came from the rabbis in the 2nd and 3rd century and beyond. Someone had to come up with these acts of faith. There are still rabbis today who are creating new rules and modifying old ones to connect their faith to the world that we live in, a world very different from that of those ancient rabbis. Ritual can be top-down, But a lot of times, rituals grow out of actions occurring and then becoming part of the practice of a faith. Rituals have a way of developing organically, especially among people with a long and sometimes forgotten history, like Tevye, who said, as you saw, "You may ask how these traditions got started. I will tell you, I don't know." There's a story of a businessman who decided to go to services in the small town that he was staying in, away from home. He sat down in the back to avoid attention. He watched as people came into the synagogue. They would walk down the center aisle. Partway down the aisle, they would stop, and they would bend over, take 3 steps, and continue to wherever they were going. He had never seen anything like this before. After service, his curiosity overcame his shyness, and he asked around. Now, some people told him that it was showing respect to God, and others to the ark in the front of the room where the Torahs are kept. Another told him that was part of the prayer you say when entering a holy space, like bowing down during praise services. Each person seemed to find the ritual important, but they often had their own reason for doing it. But one elderly member of the congregation came up to him and said, "Look, what's really happening is, when we changed the structure of this space, there was one light that hung down very low. And there were people who had to bow down to get under it until we moved it. But after they removed the light, people continued to bow. And over time, it just became part of the unique expression of this community." Now, I have heard this story several times, and I assume it's fictional. But do I have news for you? Years ago, at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Milledgeville, Georgia, you can look this up, during the communion service, people would come to the center to come up on the altar, then walk in either direction, and have to walk down 3 marble steps. At the bottom of the steps stood an altar server with his hand out like this. And as people walked by, people would tap him. I stood in awe as I watched this happening. So after services, because I am not shy, I asked the pastor, who was a friend of mine. He said, many years ago, before the Civil War, this was all built, but there were no handrails. So we had young people stand there to help people who might need help going down the stairs. Well, after Sherman destroyed this church and they rebuilt it, they put in handrails. The young people weren't standing there, and the congregation said, "We want them back." And for over 100 years, young people have been standing there and getting touched on their arm as people come down from communion. That ritual was really important to that community. And I find that fascinating. It shows how a ritual is an act that we imbibe with meaning, even when the act is meaningless to an outsider. But sometimes rituals are just comfortable, well-worn shoe. But holding on to a ritual for the sake of ritual, as Tevye suggests that they do, is not always something to celebrate. Many of you, if you went to school in this country, read a short story called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. It's a New England village where the story goes, there is a box full of pieces of paper, and members of the community all have to draw one. In the story, Tessie Hutchison draws a black dot. Now, Tessie has not been a big fan of the lottery, and now she's stuck with a black dot. What does it mean? She didn't actually win. As the story closes, the village begins to stone Tessie to death. The lottery in the stoning was said to bring about a good harvest. We learn in the narrative that some communities had given up on the lottery, but Old Man Warner called them fools. So in the end, every June, One person is chosen to be stoned to death for the sake of ritual, a ritual that actually hurts the community who uphold it, with no evidence of benefiting them. Rituals can become stagnant and even dangerous. But examining rituals is not necessarily rejecting them. It's always good to think about what your rituals say to others and how they can form barriers both inside and outside and between communities. There are rituals in some communities that separate themselves from neighbors and sometimes even put a barrier to participation fully in the community. My faith tradition has a history of this, and it wasn't until the 1800s that Jews living in other parts of the world decided that they needed to change who they were in order to be part of the greater community. It doesn't mean, however, that ritual itself is bad. It means that one should examine cost-benefit of doing a ritual. To me, rituals always feel comfortable when they have meaning, but when they do, they can be very powerful to everybody. It brings people together in a shared experience. It defines the uniqueness of a community, and it gives us a moment to think beyond ourselves. I keep kosher not because the Bible tells me what I can and can't eat, or some ancient rabbi made rules. It is because the most important part of living, the taking in of nourishment, becomes a thoughtful act. I am thinking about the food I consume, and in part, making that moment more meaningful. Creating meaning in actions is what ritual is. We all have rituals that are important to us, as individuals, as family, and as community. Think about what they mean to you, and remember, sometimes rituals should be re-examined for meaning. Men can bake bread, regardless of what Tevye tells you. They should never be perfunctory, because the power of ritual is the meaning. But meaning is up to you. You have that superpower. Thank you.